Well, yes, thank you so much, Daniel, for creating this event. And it's our pleasure as an organization to work with, organizations like Celestial Commons to, really get the word out on what is emerging in the space industry in regards to the moon, and also our take on those issues, especially with an attention today to policy. So that's what we will be leaning into. I'm going to speak at first about our organization, give a little bit of context. I'm also going to speak a little bit about the moon and what is creating urgency, importance, and the influential nature of some of the decisions that are being made around the moon right now. And then I'm going to pass to my colleague Antonino to drill down into some specifics on the latest policy thinking, the trade-offs, and also the current issues that are being tabled at the UN COPUOS event, which is currently happening in Vienna. So on the screen here, we've just got some gorgeous pictures of some of our leadership team. Our board is made up of people, from astronauts to entrepreneurs to some of the best space lawyers in the world to some of the best lunar scientists in the world. So we're really lucky to have this incredible support system for our work. Open Lunar Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit based in the United States, but we work all over the world. And Open Lunar's mission is to create a peaceful, cooperative, long-term human presence on the moon for the benefit of all life, and that means all life on and off Earth. So what we do is we look at two different feedback loops in our work. First feedback loop we look at is the feedback loop between technology and policy, because we know that as technology advances, policy often plays this role of just trying to keep up. And so a lot of what we do is also trying to keep technology and policy abreast with each other and informing each other side by side. And I'll explain more about how we do that. The other feedback loop we work with is the feedback loop between what happens in space and on Earth. And so we very much see them as one united issue. Space is not separate from Earth, in our opinion. What we do as we begin to expand human settlements into deep space and on the moon, we will actually be crafting societal design decisions about politics and economy and power, and how we operate together. And that will have a feedback loop as to how we operate here. And we've already seen that from the Cold War. We know that from the ISS. We know that space influences Earth. So in a world filled with pandemics, mega fires, disinformation war, and climate change, those are all issues that actually have a huge amount of technical overlap with space issues in terms of the way in which those issues are structured are very similar. And largely that's because more and more so today, we have issues that are outside any jurisdiction, and yet we still need to govern them. We still need to figure out a way forward and figure out a way to support humans to play nice on the surface of the Earth. So space has an incredible opportunity for us in order to actually carve out new ways of managing issues that go beyond borders, and in fact, issues that go into an environment that will never have borders. So for those of you not aware, the Outer Space Treaty does not allow for us to carve up the moon between countries, and Antonio could talk more about that. Our organization focuses on a long-term goal of creating public utilities for cislunar space supported by policy. What do I mean by that? I mean that when the railroads were laid across the United States, the way that that was done and the degree of economic power and access that was attributed to the people who owned those railroads then had a flow-on effect to how the society was created around it. And so when we think about public utilities like power, water, communications, internet, these things that run our lives, these will be set up on the moon, and our interest is to have those done in a really, really effective way that stimulates and fosters cooperation and incentivizes a sort of a collaborative governance approach. By default, in today's approach to lunar development, we are more likely to see siloed, individualized lunar programs that are not coordinated with each other. And so a lot of what we do is try and knit those together and say, hey, did you know that you two are both thinking about this? Or how can we see more of this happening across different parties? What have we done to date, just so you're aware of who we are? Look, we've done some engineering. We've open sourced a lunar orbiter design, and that took us about 2 years and 15 engineers who've built hundreds of satellites between them. So we get people together who are really good at what they do, and we contribute to this lunar economy development. So in that case, we were trying to raise all boats by providing an open source set of technological solutions to hard issues like how do we get to the moon with tiny equipment? How do we do that cheaper and cheaper over time, which is a big interest in the industry. We've also done a huge amount in policy. We advocate for quite specific policy solutions in certain areas, while at the same time playing a more neutral convening role, sort of diplomatic role to support multiple parties to come together and talk about difficult issues, including bringing together parties from different nations that may or may not otherwise talk to each other. These days, what we do more of is the bridge building between those two worlds. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the interface between policy and tech. And one of the ways we do that is look at how do we bring policy into action? How do we make it not just theory, not just a bunch of debates in a bunch of political chambers, but actually say, what can we do in practice that will stimulate policy precedent setting and development? An example of that is we have an entity that we run that is a fund, it's a trust, but it's a fund that is charged with the work of purchasing lunar soil from companies that land on the moon and who gather up some lunar soil into a little container. And then we purchase that, hold title to it or have ownership of it. And then that gives us the opportunity to discuss with the global community, what does it mean to own a container of regolith? What does it mean to have title to something in a context where property rights are normally enforced by a government? And this is, again, outside a government. What does that actually mean? It's an example of policy in action for us in the short term. In the big picture, like I said, working towards public utility development, and our big interest in that area at the moment is lunar communications. So this year, our top priorities are resource rights, and we'll talk more about that. Antonino will touch on that. But again, how are we developing our concept of the rights access, the rights to alienation, the rights to protection, if you are involved in doing work with lunar resources or work with space resources in general, lunar ones being the precedent-setting ones? How are we developing lunar communication systems? In this case, how are the radios designed to work together? What kind of systems are we setting in place so that different entities can communicate with each other easily in and around the moon? And then lastly, our ongoing policy work that provides a basis for lunar policy proposals. So just before I hand over to Antonino, I'll give you a really fast little tour of what's happening with the moon at the moment. So I'll just start off by saying, for those who are less familiar, it's very common for people to have the conception that the moon and the development of the moon is far off and we're not going to do it anytime soon. Well, actually, it couldn't be more the opposite, really. And it's always a bit of a surprise when I say things to people like, there are 10 missions to the moon planned in the next 12 months. There are billions invested by different nation states in lunar development. It's not only going to the moon to visit, but people who are interested in going to the moon, quote unquote, to stay or for long-term missions. So we're at this incredible inflection point in the cost of rocketry, which has been dropping, which allows massive access to deep space that we've never had before, which means that you not only have your standard participants in the space industry, such as, US, China, Russia, India, etc., but you've also got this myriad of tiny little companies and also smaller countries that are entering into mission development in their own path. And not all of those incentives are aligned. Everyone's going for different reasons. And there's sort of, as Antonino has said to me last week, it's at risk of being a cacophony. It's at risk of being out of harmony, all these different activities happening and not very coordinated. So a lot of people who are just getting into this topic sort of go, well, there are asteroids, there's Mars, like, why an overemphasis on the moon? Isn't it a bit of an arbitrary emphasis? And I think a couple of points on why the moon. First of all, it's cheap to get there. It's the closest thing. So it's going to be the first place that people operate side by side. So it's not going to be, and Mars is very expensive to get to. So you might have a few missions, over the next 10 years. But with the lunar context, you're going to have many, many missions right next to each other, needing to figure out how to coordinate, needing to figure out how to deconflict their activities. There's an unprecedented amount of coordination that's going to be required. And that is going to be the precedent-setting set of behaviors. Because as soon as there's the equivalent of case law, if you will, about how to handle it when someone bumps up against somebody else, that's then going to have huge implications for how we do it forever on after that. Another thing about the moon that's special is that it's quite unchanging. It doesn't have an atmosphere. It doesn't have an ecological cycle. So whatever we do there will stay the same for quite a long time, which means that, going back to the point Daniel was making a few minutes ago, the environmental management issues that are related to the moon are quite severe because the Apollo footprints are still there, right? Or when a Starship from SpaceX hypothetically lands on the moon, the quantity of dust that's kicked up from that all over the global it will basically circumnavigate the moon and come back to itself. That's how much dust activity there will be. And that once that dust settles, that will happen over and over again with every landing and takeoff. And that will have irreversible effects on the surface of the moon. So these are the kinds of things we need to figure out today. How do we want that to be handled? And lastly, this issue of resources. This will be the first place that, there's a lot of ambition to do successful mining and extractive activity to gain valuable resources from deep space. And the moon will be the first place, the testing ground where that occurs, with special attention to water ice, which is the absolutely most, everyone's making a beeline for figuring out whether or not we can extract lunar water ice. So on that topic briefly, here's an image of, I believe, the south pole of the moon, and the aquamarine dots show some areas in which we have some proof that there is some water ice stored in the very, very cold, dark parts of those craters. Now, this is valuable for a number of reasons. H2O is made up of hydrogen, which makes rocket fuel. H2O is also something humans drink, and H2O also has oxygen, which is something humans breathe. So if we can crack the code of figuring out how to utilize some H2O molecules, retrieve them out of the surface of the moon, and we've got evidence that there are hundreds of tons of this substance all over the surface of the moon, then we may be able to have some activities that are quite well sustained on the surface for, if you can imagine, humans utilizing water that's from the moon rather than carting huge amounts of water to the moon from Earth. That's going to be a game changer as to whether or not humans stick around on the moon for any length of time. But another one is there's a vision to use the moon as sort of like a gas station or a transport hub, if you will. It's at the top of Earth's gravity well, which means that if you want to jump off the surface of the moon and go to Mars, it's a heck of a lot easier to do that than jumping off the surface of Earth. You don't need big rockets to get out of the gravity of the moon in comparison. So if we were to utilize the moon as a transport hub, and if there was hydrogen gas and hydrogen fuel available to be used as rocket fuel, you would have this incredible opportunity to have sort of the moon as a gas station and as an airport sort of a thing, or as a spaceport. So there's a lot of reasons we care about water, and there's some incredible missions coming up to clarify whether or not that water is usable. Big picture here, like I said before, billions is being invested into not only going to the moon for a visit, but actually how can we stick around for the long term? So again, for those who are a little bit newer to this, if you think about a multi-step process to get to the bottom step here, permanent settlement on the moon, there's quite a lot between here and there that we need to figure out. Most of the industry's capability as it is today is in steps 1 and 2, transport and robotic missions. However, it's not actually an unconceivable amount of work or money to get us to number 6. And so there are some assessments that show that if there was a high amount of cooperation between different space agencies and a dedicated budget, we could reach permanent settlement on the moon for less than a couple of $1 billion and in less than 10 years. And again, that relies on cooperation, which we're really interested in. So in a nutshell here, you need to get to the moon and back. And then we need to send some robots to figure out what it's actually like there and how to survive the radiation, the dust environment, the temperature fluctuations, etc. And then as we get into human missions, first there'll be short visits, then there'll be longer research missions that are similar perhaps to the ISS, people going for 3 to 6 months. And then you've got long human missions, perhaps similar to going to Antarctica to study something on the ice, go there for a year, something like that. But until we have some of that resource utilization happening on the moon in a local way, in a let's get water out of the crater instead of shipping it from Earth, we're very unlikely to hit the permanent settlement part. There would need to be sustainable agriculture and ongoing in situ or localized life support systems for that. And that is definitely more a step up in terms of technological challenge. So that's just sort of giving you a bit of a map of how we would do that. Just before I hand over to Antonino, I'll give you this list of different organizations and missions that are going to the moon soon. And so that, as you can see, there's quite a lot of them. highlighted a couple on screen here that are doing, really awesome work and are really advanced. There's actually a mission to the moon scheduled for next Monday. The Capstone mission, funded by NASA, designed and built by Advanced Space and flown on a Rocket Lab rocket on their Proton. This is just how frequent these missions are. So that one's going to be testing out a lunar orbit, not going to the surface, whereas some of these are going to the surface. So they're all going for different reasons, like I said. And a lot of these are small companies that are working in partnership with governmental agencies that are funding them, and are working in partnership oftentimes with large defense organizations such as the Lockheed Martins, the Boeings, in order to also benefit from the technology that those organizations have to offer as well. So a lot of these missions are small, organizations that are supported by an ecosystem of other activity in order to succeed. But there are so many of them, it's really going to change the shape of lunar development to have all of these happening in the next sort of 24 months. So hopefully that's useful context for all of you. And now I'll pass to Antonino. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. That was a wonderful scene that you set for the discussion on policy. So, all right. Everything that Chelsea just talked about, right? The idea of going to the moon and back, the idea of progressing on the moon, it all depends on policy. It all depends on what we said over Lunar, getting the moon right. And it is also connected to what Daniel mentioned before. We want to avoid repeating the mistakes that we did on Earth on the moon. So let's begin with our policy part of the presentation, which is, you will see, is very much intertwined. So what I wanted to do with this slide is I took the steps that Chelsea mentioned 1 second ago about how do we go to a lunar summit, right? What are the key concrete steps that we need to make? And I wanted to show you side by side how important are the policy developments in order to achieve those goals, and in order to set up what are the fundamental requirements that we need in order to move from one element to the other. So as you will see, we increment our presence on the moon, we also need to increment the level of governance that we want to involve, and we need to ensure incremental objectives, more and more ambitious. So these missions that Chelsea just mentioned before, which are mostly meant to set the fundamental, foundations for going to the moon, they can be governed at the national level, right? In policy, we just need to make sure that these companies will respect international space law as it exists already. So we do not need to invent new rules. We just need to make sure that the rules that we have will be respected by all these actors in a very difficult and new and challenging environment. When we take the next step, which is the one of robotic missions, beginning to, flood the moon with activity and get, of course, much more interest in different types of activities on the moon, then we need to take a step forward. And that is international coordination. And as Chelsea mentioned before, this will be critical because the moon is a very special environment. And as the number of actors on the lunar surface increases, then so we need to develop mechanisms and tools to coordinate their presence, to mostly prevent interference, right? We need to make sure that everyone can achieve their goals on the moon, and that can happen in a peaceful and safe manner so that we avoid international incidents and accidents, because as you know, we already have plenty on Earth and we definitely don't want to have more happening on the moon. If we do this right, if we allow robots to do their job and to give us the knowledge we need to know more about the moon, then we can begin with short human missions. And that will require a further step forward also in terms of policy, because we will move from coordination to cooperation. And here the difference is just is as substantive as you can imagine, because we will go from essentially negative type of policies, which will be more don't do this, or if you do this, please let me know, from let's do this together. And so the purpose of international cooperation in the early stages of lunar development, in number 3, as Chelsea numbered them here, would be develop the infrastructure we need to sustain human presence in the long term. So we will put down the foundation for these public utilities, which will be so important for our future on the moon. And we better do it together. Together doesn't mean that everyone has to do everything for free. It means that we need to be aligned. It means having interoperable infrastructure that everyone can use, and hopefully agree on the foundational utilities that we need to have, like power, like roads, like landing systems, and so on. Things that if we share, they also work better. And so for that, we need tools for cooperation. Again, if we do that right, if everything goes well, with the fundamental stages, then we can begin to think about new rules for the moon. So everything that will happen between 1 and 3 is what we already have. It's just about applying it to the moon. When we go into human robotic integration, which is this, steps that intensify activities on the moon, we will need what we call multi-level governance, which means that we need to create new rules which are more specifically tailored to the moon. That will happen at the national level in order to ensure adaptability and flexibility. But that will also need to happen under an international harmonization context to make sure that, again, we're going into the same direction and that we do not have conflicting rules that then can create tensions and then ultimately jeopardize our activities on the moon. And then if that goes well again, we go into long-term human missions and into what we used to call polycentric governance. Polycentric governance is a concept that we will go at the end of this presentation as well, that describes the idea of having different frameworks for different activities. And that will allow our activities on the moon to expand, to grow, and to increase, and to ensure that all actors can participate in their activities as well. And finally, if all of that would have worked fine and we would have reached the capabilities that we need from a technical and legal perspective, then we can have permanent settlements, and those will be governed autonomously under the principle of self-determination and hopefully kick off a new beginning of human race and also of international space law. Next slide, please. Now, in order to achieve all of that, we need to, first of all, sort out certain new issues that we need to discuss with Lunar, with specific reference to lunar governance. And there are so many, but here I wanted to give you a highlight of what are the most important ones. Let's say the top 5 of lunar policy debate. At number 1, Chelsea already mentioned it several times, you see access and use of lunar resources, which is so important for 2 reasons. One, because we need to figure it out how to use resources to ensure sustainable development on the moon. And on the other hand, because the resources are so important, this is a very controversial topic. Everyone wants to avoid that we repeat mistakes of monopolization and cartelization that we have on Earth on the moon. And so this topic is particularly sensitive to a number of states. Related to lunar resources, there is the topic of safety zone, which for those of you who may not be familiar with the topic, is essentially an area declared in the given time frame of an operation to ensure that there is no harmful interference. And so how do we coordinate when you're doing mining operation on the moon? How do we ensure safety? How big this zone need to be? And how does it actually work to enter a safety zone, avoiding the interference with those who are inside and ensuring the safety of everyone? Cooperative development of standards and infrastructure is another critical item, because as I said before, if we want to ensure that everyone can go to the moon, that we want to get the moon right, we need to do certain things together. We need to have universal standards for lunar infrastructure, and hopefully we need to be able to rely on the same type of infrastructure so that we can spend the money for everything else. Everyone going to the moon would not have to bring with them power, landing, and other fundamental facilities. We can rely on what's already on the moon, and that will increase access enormously. Related to that, and while we do that, it is still important to remind that the moon is critical for science, right? There is so much science we can do on the moon, and we want to make sure that as we go and use resources, as we go and develop infrastructure, we still protect key scientific objectives, such as the observation of the universe from the far side of the moon, that allows for unique radio astronomy that we can do. And then the final item, which is also the one that connects them all, is the creation of a sustainable economy. The only way we can go permanently on the moon is if we make sure that we have an in situ need and demand for services and goods. Because if this has to be subsidized indefinitely by governments on Earth, it will never fly, right? What we need to do instead is to make sure that there is a circular economy on the moon and that actors can work together, ultimately becoming independent in the long term. Next slide, please. Now, these issues are discussed, of course, at the international level. And I can tell you that the United Nations is very concerned and very involved in the discussions about how do we regulate the use of outer space and the moon in particular. This happens through a dedicated UN body, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. This was created in 1958, so right after the launch of the Sputnik 1, and in time it grew to reach this year a number of 100 states. So essentially all states involved in space activities are represented in UN Corpus, and they discuss a number of issues. They discuss technical, legal, and then the bigger picture perspective through 3 different branches. And each of the Corpus branches meets once a year, and this marks the final week of the meeting of the plenary branch, which essentially brings together the discussion held under the legal and technical subcommittee. Now, despite this huge number of member states, COPUOS decides by consensus, which makes it very difficult to keep up with an increasingly packed agenda. You can imagine that everything that matters in space is discussed within UN COPUOS. Just to give you an example, key areas from 2022 discussions have been the protection of the skies on Earth, so the Dark Skies initiatives, the use of space resources. The legal subcommittee just created a new working group on the legal aspects of space resource activities. And of course, because we want to be mindful of the world we live in, and as Chelsea said, space and Earth are the same, they're connected. Space for climate is another critical topic. But earlier today, this is very exciting news that I'm happy to report to you, two states, Mexico and Romania, proposed the creation of a new agenda item to discuss lunar coordination. That shows you that the increasing number of activities on the moon is also on the radar of COPUOS. Open Lunar is also represented in COPUOS as observer. Today, I had the honor of delivering a statement on behalf of Open Lunar. And what we did was exactly what we're doing now, informing the committee that there is so much going on the moon and that we need to discuss this in a policy context. Next slide, please. Now, this is informing you about what the situation is, but what is that Open Lunar thinks about this? What is our view, our take on how do we address all the different challenges that we mentioned before, and how do we progress lunar policy and technology side by side for the future, for the thriving future of humankind on the moon? And our response to that is polycentricity. Now, we talk about polycentricity, first of all, for a factual reason, because the moon is not a monolith, right? Even though we tend to look at it as one thing, it is in fact made of many different systems. And over the last year in 2021, Open Lunar conducted a study and identified 20 plus types of lunar resource systems, as we call them. And they are so different from each other. You can imagine electromagnetic spectrum, lunar ice, solar energy. There is so many different resources we can find and use on the moon, and different resources have different features, and different features require different rules. That's why polycentricity responds to the need of different framework by organizing governance in horizontal networks. Instead of vertical silos, one body that decides everything and the same rule for every activity, we want to have different centers of governance connected with each other and addressing different issues based on the principle of subsidiarity, which means that issues should be discussed and resolved by those who are the more close to the issue and to the consequences of the decisions that we take. And ultimately, polycentricity, in our view, will help us develop the moon as a circular ecosystem, an environment of peace and prosperity for the benefit of all life. And with that, I will conclude my part of the presentation. Thank you so very much.